I was just reading the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders put out by the American Psychiatric Association. It's very exciting reading. And I was thinking about the beginnings of modern psychology and how we've arrived at the place we're at today, where we have all of the diagnoses that we find in this book for different mental disorders. You know, about 150 years ago there was no such thing as modern psychology, and then a man named Sigmund Freud kind of burst on the scene, and he had these very provocative theories and kind of a new language, and he really fathered the movement of modern psychology. Right there in the beginnings, the mental illness that was the primary focus of research was schizophrenia. And that was so for quite a long period of time, until about 60, 70 years ago things started to develop. There was a new disorder that was discovered called split personality. Today we call it dissociative identity disorder, but this disorder was popularized through a movie called Sybil, starring Sally Fields. She received an award for the part that she played. She played a young lady named Sybil who had 16 different personalities. And so that mental disorder became kind of widely known. And from there, the number of mental disorders rapidly increased until today in the diagnostic manual we have over 300 different diagnoses. Lots of different things can go wrong with the human mind. It's really kind of funny, some of these diagnoses. In fact, there's one called mathematics disorder. I'm sure I had that when I was in 4th grade. There's another one called conduct disorder, which I'm sure my brother had when he was in 4th grade, except I just called him a brat. And you know, there's a disorder for just about every substance that a person can become addicted to. So a person is no longer addicted to cigarettes, for instance. They have nicotine dependence disorder. Now some people say this is ridiculous, these are just excuses for bad behavior, and in some cases that's true, but there's a very practical reason why there are so many disorders in this book, and that reason is called managed care. Back in the 1990s there were kind of runaway medical costs, and the insurance companies wanted to kind of rein things in. So they set up a system called managed care, and what managed care does is it makes it possible for the insurance companies to dictate to the providers of services, whether it's counseling or medical services, what they can do and how many times they can treat that person and so forth. So I, as a therapist, must prove that my client has a disorder before their insurance will pay me. Now, really, psychology is a business, and so therapists need to be paid, so they have to diagnose their clients, and that's why we have so many diagnoses. But there's no small amount of discussion as to how these diagnoses affect people. In fact, some believe that when you diagnose a person, you might be adding to their problems just because of the stigmatization of being labeled with a disorder. Some say, well, it's going to cause them to have low self-esteem. It's going to affect them socially. It could affect their employment. It could affect them professionally. It could even affect them legally. This is something we need to do with utmost care, and they're right. It can affect a person's self-concept to be labeled with something wrong. For some people, though, it works in a little different way. Some people, when they're diagnosed with something, suddenly have a sense of identity that they've never had before. And sometimes it turns into kind of an excuse for bad behavior. Well, I'm borderline, so I can't help but be irresponsible, that type of thing. In either case, what we see when a person is diagnosed and when they are labeled is the potential for something that in psychology we call the self-fulfilling prophecy syndrome. The self-fulfilling prophecy syndrome is just this, very simple. A person comes to believe something about themselves, and then they begin to act according to that belief. So ostensibly, if the self-fulfilling prophecy syndrome is at work, a person could not really have anything wrong with them, but once they are diagnosed and then labeled, then they can start to act as if that really is wrong with them, and eventually it can come to pass. So we need to be very careful when we diagnose people. How do we keep from identifying wholly with these weaknesses and problems and disorders that we have? If you are indeed someone who can be diagnosed with one of these disorders? How do you avoid that becoming kind of the sum total of who you are? Well, that's the subject of a lot of discussion as well. And this is why we use verbiage, that we use phrases like person with schizophrenia instead of schizophrenic, or person with anorexia instead of anorexic, because we want to regard the human being that's at the core of that individual rather than defining that individual by their disorder. So the question remains, how do we ensure that we don't define ourselves by what's wrong with us? And this applies to anything. It applies to mistakes we've made. It applies to sins we've committed. It applies to weaknesses we have. It applies to our past. It applies to these diagnoses that some of us have. How do we keep from identifying wholly with whatever is wrong with us? How do we keep a sense that we are a person, a human being, in spite of our flaws? Well, there is a key to that in another thick book. And I read this thick book a lot, you can tell, because it's all beat up. This is the Bible. And the Bible does give a key as to how not to identify with one's weaknesses without going to the other extreme of denying one's weaknesses and problems. And one of the ways that key is expressed is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It says, "If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things have become new." I don't know exactly how to describe how faith in Jesus results in us having at our very core a sense that we are someone apart from our flaws and weaknesses and problems. But it does reinstate a sense of self-respect, a sense of self-worth. Now, this might be one of the primary differences between this heavy, thick book and this heavy, thick book, because this book does an amazing job of describing everything that can go wrong with the human mind. This book not only describes what's wrong, but it gives a solution to the problem. I highly recommend that you read this one because it will be a source of great encouragement.